Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters, your Magic the Gathering source that helps you command your budget. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. We also have a ton of brand new t-shirt designs in stock, so make sure you check out those as well. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG Player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all of their support. Hey everyone, Mitch coming in for the Commander's Quarters studio. Welcome to the show. So today's episode is going to be a bit of a different one where I talk about what very well might be the best worst card of all time with Tempting Wurm. And a big thank you to Mac from my playgroup for showing off this card in one of your awesome decks. But to find out what this card does and why I am saying that it very well might be the best worst card of all time, let's jump into it to find out. Tempting Wurm is a 5/5 worm, obviously, that costs 1 and a green. Its Oracle text reads, when it enters the battlefield, each opponent may put any number of artifact, creature, enchantment, and or land cards from their hand onto the battlefield. Now, this card actually came out in Onslaught back when I first started playing Magic, and it was definitely an interesting one. I'm pretty sure I opened up in a pack at some point and I was like, what in the world? Now, in a different kind of format like Standard, back then, if you put down a 2-drop that is a 5/5, if your opponents really don't have much to put down from their hand, you could very quickly steamroll them with a super early 5/5. Now, on the off chance that they're not playing a Spellslinger deck and they also have some decent things to throw into play for free, you could be in big trouble, obviously. But this card obviously operates on a whole nother level when it comes to a format like Commander, which again obviously has 4 players. You drop this simple 5/5 down on turn 2, and it's no longer just one opponent who is getting things into play for free, but all of your opponents. This can unexpectedly speed up every player's clock and just have players dumping their entire hands essentially into play. Except for you. It's kind of like braids, but for everyone else and sped up to an absurd amount. Obviously, this could be seen as a very bad thing, hence the title, best worst card. Outside of instant sorceries and planeswalkers, your opponents can essentially dump everything else from their hands into play, and in some cases that might be their entire hand. Now again, that might seem like the worst thing ever, and in some scenarios it is, but in other scenarios, again because it's a multiplayer format, some very interesting things can happen. Again, everyone else might be sitting out there with full boards and no hands, but you yourself just have, probably 2 lands in this 5/5 worm, and you really aren't a threat. So your opponents might have bigger issues to deal with, like, the other opponents, and you might just get left alone. So again, you can kind of see this card in a different light in that way, and again, why it is kind of the best worst card of all time. It has an effect that seems like a massive downside in a format like Commander, but it actually can work out for you in certain scenarios. And of course, I'm going to walk you through some ways to take advantage of this, but first, generally, if you are going to see this card being played, typically you're going to see it in group hug style decks with cards like Rites of Flourishing, Heartbeat of Spring, and Hunted Wumpus. These cards work to benefit all or other players. For example, Rites of Flourishing says at the beginning of each player's draw step, the player draws an additional card. Each player may play an additional land on each of their turns. So this helps draw everyone extra cards and helps speed up everyone's land base. Speaking of which, Heartbeat of Spring says whenever a player taps a land for mana, the player adds 1 mana of any type that land produced, so this essentially doubles up the value of everyone's lands. And then Hunted Wumpus is probably the closest thing to this worm, which is a 6/6 beast for 3 and a green. It says when it enters the battlefield, each other player may put a creature card from their hand onto the battlefield. So again, this is a smaller effect than Tempting Wurm, limiting opponents to just 1 creature, but still if opponents have massive creatures in their hand, they can get them out for free with this. Now, there are group hug decks out there that really don't have any intention of winning and just look to either benefit other players or to make the game take a very long time, and again, Tempting Wurm might see play in those kinds of decks. Some group hug decks might speed things up in these ways, but also use ways to control the board to slow things down and benefit players that are behind. But speaking of speeding things up, One kind of funny thing that I do want to point out with Tempting Wurm is that, again, in Commander, obviously, it is possible to get it out on turn 1 with things like Elvish Spirit Guide or Chancellor of the Tangle or Chrome Mox. Elvish Spirit Guide can be exiled from your hand, add a green to your mana pool. Chancellor of the Tangle says you may reveal this card from your opening hand. If you do, at the beginning of your first main phase, add green to your mana pool. And of course, Chrome Mox is one of the non-banned Moxes in Commander. And obviously, if you can get it into play, you can use it for mana on turn 1. Again, just consider how absurd of a start of a Commander game this could be. It might be the most absurd start of any Commander game of all time. Again, turn 1, if you're on the play, getting a Tempting Wurm out, no one else has played absolutely anything, but they can all of a sudden basically dump their entire hands onto the board. Now again, that might seem like an awful thing for you, but again, your opponents might have to focus on each other because again, the threats that they dumped onto the board right away. But again, like I mentioned before with this best worst card, there are actually ways that you can take advantage of your opponents putting a ton of things into play. And with this massive incentive to dump their entire hand onto the board, it's going to be very difficult for them to actually hold things back because again, your other opponents are going to be doing the same. But of course, there's even a way that you can as well. So, some ways to potentially take advantage of Tempting Wurm is with cards like Fractured Identity and Tempt with Reflections. Fractured Identity is a sorcery that says, exile target non-land permanent, each player other than its controller creates a token that's a copy of it. So, this one can be quite comical because you're essentially saying, hey, I really don't care all that much about my 5/5 in play, so I'm just gonna give one to all of my opponents. Now, all of your opponents already got that trigger at least once, but now when you give it to all of them, well, that trigger is happening again for every single opponent. Or should I say again, every single one of their opponents, which again, obviously includes you. In a similar way, there's Tempt with Reflections, which says, Tempting Offer, choose target creature you control, put a token onto the battlefield that's a copy of that creature. Each opponent may put a token onto the battlefield that's a copy of that creature. For each opponent who does, put a token onto the battlefield that's a copy of that creature. With this one, you might actually have to make a deal with an opponent to take this Tempting Offer. They're essentially only going to be getting a benefit. There's no downside to them as long as they're willing to work with you. They get a 5/5 and you get that trigger for yourself. Regardless, obviously with each of these, there are ways for you to take advantage of this trigger, much like in a braid stack where you just have massive things in your hand that you can dump into play. So yeah, Fractured Identity is definitely one that's more reliable, but Tempt Reflections could work as well. That being said, you can also take advantage of Tempting Wurm in different ways with something like Scholarship Sponsor. It has, when it enters the battlefield, each player controls fewer lands than the player controls the most lands search their library for a number of basic land cards less than or equal to the difference, puts those cards on the battlefield tapped, then shuffles. Essentially, if one player had more lands than the others in their hand, they just dump them into play. Now this gets everyone up to the exact same amount. Speaking of getting everyone to the exact same amount, how about a card like Hour of Revelation? This takes things in a different direction. It's a sorcery for 3 white, but it's going to cost 3 less to cast if there are 10 or more non-land permanents on the battlefield, which there are going to be, most likely. It says destroy all non-land permanents. So, after your opponents are essentially forced to dump their entire hands into play, you just say goodbye to everything. Again, opponents are incentivized to take advantage of Tempting Wurm and put everything that they can into play because your other opponents are most likely going to be doing that too, so they don't want to be behind. But because of that, then, they might be out of gas. So in a cruel twist of fate, you can essentially put them in top decking mode by saying, hey, put all your cool things into play, then say goodbye to all your cool things. Or obviously a somewhat similar card to this one is Blasphemous Act, and basically it's just going to cost you a red, and it's going to deal 13 damage to each creature. So again, by incentivizing opponents to get a lot of things into play, including creatures, this can make this cost basically next to nothing and help you get rid of all the creatures that were in their hands. So as your opponents might think that you're being very generous in letting them put everything into play, you might have some ulterior motives. Speaking of which, you also might want to utilize your opponent's creatures that they put down in different ways, like with things like Disrupt Decorum, Geode Rager, and the lovely Goad Mechanic. Disrupt Decorum is a sorcery that says, goad all creatures you don't control, which means until your next turn, those creatures attack each combat if able and attack a player other than you if able. And then Geode Rager is basically a repeatable source of goading. It says whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, goad each creature target player controls. So again, essentially, you are allowing players to get an absurd number of things into play, including potentially some massive creatures, and then you are forcing your opponent's creatures to help take each other out. But of course, there are other ways to take advantage of all of our opponent's creatures. You know, with things like Insurrection, or one of my personal more budget favorites, Mob Rule. Insurrection says untap all creatures and gain control of them until end of turn. They gain haste until end of turn. And Mob Rule says choose one, gain control of all creatures with power 4 or greater until end of turn. Untap those creatures that gain haste until end of turn. Or you can do the same, but for creatures with power 3 or less. Basically, again, you can utilize your opponent's creatures against them by playing Tempting Wurm at the right moment. Maybe you just wheeled and got everyone back a massive hand that they can now dump into play, and then you say, let's just take all those creatures that were yours and now they're mine. Temporarily, but gonna be long enough to take you out. And of course, there are some other sneaky plays that you can do as well, with things like Clone Legion, Role Reversal, and Worse Fears. Clone Legion says for each creature target player controls, create a token that's a copy of that creature. So this one gets you one player's specific creatures, but again, if there's one player that has the most massivest, awesomest creatures on the board, getting creature token copies of those can be very impactful. Or, you can just switch things up with something like Role Reversal or another exchange spell like it. It says exchange control of 2 target permanents that share a permanent type. So maybe you're willing to ditch your little 5/5 Wurm and give it to someone else in exchange for their much more awesome massive creature. Maybe they've got an Eldrazi and now it's your Eldrazi. Or, you can just throw a massive wrench into opponent's plans with Worst Fears. It says you control target player during that player's next turn, exile Worst Fears. So if one player got way ahead of everyone else by getting all the things down, well, just, take their turn and do the worst things for them. Utilize their creatures to, of course, help take other opponents out, and maybe use whatever spells they might have left in their hand to take out their own things. Basically, put them in the worst position that they possibly can be in. But again, typically when you do see Tempting Wurm, it might be in a group hug deck such as Chaos and Hero of Meltis. Again, most group hug decks are looking to actually benefit all players, and some might not even care about actually winning the game. Though there are other decks that, again, I would like to more so call political control versus group hug that actually do have ways to win. In an example like Chaos and Hero of Meltis, you might have an Insurrection or a Mob Rule again because you got access to red. And with this commander in particular, you actually get more benefits out of it than potentially other group hug commanders. This one says, at the beginning of your end step, draw a card. Each player may put a land card from their hand on the battlefield, then each opponent who didn't draws a card. Basically, you get both benefits, and your opponents are going to be getting one or the other. Regardless, again, an early Tempting Wurm in a deck like this can really speed things up. But now that we're talking about commanders, really quick, let me talk about another commander in a very similar concept. Because with Cody Vociferous Codex and Hypergenesis in a deck built around it, you can actually work in a very similar way to Tempting Wurm, but with a twist. Cody is a 1/4 construct that costs 3, and it says you can't cast permanent spells. By paying 4 and tapping it, you add Wooburg, and when you cast your next spell this turn, you exile card to the top of your library until you exile an instant or sorcery card with lesser mana value. Until end of turn, you may cast that card without paying its mana cost. Put each other card exiled this way on the bottom of your library in a random order. So, Cody is a commander that I've brought up on quite a few episodes at this point, and Cody is a very unique commander in that, well, it is a 5-color commander, and you can build some pretty off-the-wall decks around it. For example, with that trigger, when you cast a 1-mana spell, you reveal cards off the top of your library until you hit something that costs 0, which typically you're not going to have anything in your deck that costs 0, but in this case, you're going to have 1 card in your deck that costs 0, and that's going to be Hypergenesis. It's a sorcery with spend 3 for 1 green, and it says, starting with you, each player may put an artifact, creature, enchantment, or land card from their hand onto the battlefield. Repeat this process until no one puts a card on the battlefield. So this works in a similar way to Tempting Wurm, but it also includes you. So although Cody doesn't let you cast permanent spells, again by casting a 1-mana instant or sorcery, you essentially, again, cascade. I know it's not cascade, but you basically cascade into Hypergenesis, you cast it, and then the fun starts. And with a deck specifically built around this, yeah, you're going to have some pretty massive things to dump into play from your hand. So just something to consider if you are looking for a deck built around this kind of interaction. Regardless, yeah, there's a lot of reasons that I like to say that Tempting Wurm very well might be the best worst card of all time in Commander. It's definitely an interesting and unique card that can very well lead to some very interesting and unique Commander games. And again, a big thank you to Mac for reminding me that this card exists. And with that, the show has come to a close, so it's my turn to hear from you. So the comments below, let me know your thoughts on this episode are, and as always, thanks again and have a good one.